A good starting point when studying genetic inheritance is looking at the similarity we share as human beings with animals. 100% genetic similarity with chimpanzees, 99% with dogs and mice, 75% with chicken, and even 60% with fruit flies. So, the ATL question for you to think about is if human beings have such high similarity rate with the genes of other animals, what is it that makes us so very different and advanced from them? And this is also important for HL students to consider because it will be a topic explored in your extension. So, the nature versus nurture debate has been going on for decades. Psychologists and biologists have argued with one another, trying to establish that nature is more important in determining the characteristics and behaviors of an individual, while the other group has tried to establish that nurture is more important. Nature is what is within us, our genetic inheritance and other biological factors, and nurture is basically the environment that influences us and also our upbringing. The debate of nature and nurture, even though it went on for a really long time, it has finally come to rest, and there has been a consensus in the scientific society that both nature and nurture play important roles and cannot be viewed in isolation, and as being literally single-handedly responsible for behaviors and characteristics. So the consensus now is that it's not just genetic inheritance that causes a behavior, but genetic inheritance in relation to nurture, which is our environment. So behavioral genetics is a field that has been established based on this debate and is one that deals with understanding how both genetics and the environment contribute to individual variations in human behavior. When psychologists argue that behavior may be inherited, what exactly does that mean? What is inherited in the genes that give the rise to the development of specific physiological processes that contribute to specific traits and behavior? It is not possible or probable that a single gene is responsible for complex behaviors such as intelligence, altruism, criminal behavior, aggression, and even attachment. Instead, what is inherited by us is just a building block for such kind of behavior, such complex behaviors. Psychologists now argue that an individual may have a genetic predisposition towards a certain behavior. However, without the appropriate environmental stimulation, the gene is not switched on and the behavior is not expressed. So, a person can have a predisposition for depression that is passed on from maybe her mother's family or his mother's family, but it's not necessary for that person to have depression in their life without an environmental trigger. So the gene is not switched on unless there is an environmental trigger. So an environmental trigger could be stress from IB or stress from a breakup or financial problems. So there are different environmental stimuli that can influence or trigger the manifestation of a predisposed gene or predisposed behavior. So epigenetic, that's the next term that I would like to introduce to you, which is what is basically beyond the gene, the environmental exposure that an individual faces, which is also hypothesized to influence which gene is switched on and which one isn't. So this whole switching on and off of gene is called gene expression, and I will talk about that a little more in brief later on. An example of an epigenetic influence or epigenetic change is when a woman who is pregnant is smoking throughout her pregnancy, and this goes on to influence 3 generations of people just through that behavior. She basically induces epigenetic change in the 3 generations at once in herself, her unborn daughter, and her daughter's reproduction cells as well. So, not just herself, but her daughter and her daughter or her son that is to come later on. And this can also be an explanation for a lot of reasons why people who have a history in their family with addiction of also tend to manifest it or develop an addiction towards substances in their lifetime. Okay, so the essential understandings, we've gone over quite a few things in the last lecture and this lecture. But the basic essential understanding that you need to have are basically of a few points. The first being offsprings inherit genetic material from both parents, half their chromosomes from their father and the other half from their mother. Through these genes, offspring inherit characteristics and predispositions for specific behaviors and even disorders. A genetic predisposition, which is also referred to as vulnerability for a case wherein, let's say, it's a disorder or where it's a disease, it's considered a vulnerability, which basically means you have, like it says here, an increased likelihood of developing a characteristic, behavior, or disorder based on a person's genetic makeup. So let's say, going back to the example of depression, let's say my mother had depression and her mother had depression as well. The likelihood that I have a genetic predisposition for developing depression is high. This does not mean that I will have depression in my lifetime. It just increases my likelihood to have it. So, like I was saying, it is not necessary for all genetic material that is passed on to be switched on, which means that not all predisposed characteristics manifest in the offspring. Again, this switching on and switching off is basically what we refer to as gene expression. Expression being, is it showing, is it not showing? Okay, so if it's expressed, that means the behavior is shown, depression is manifested in me. If it's not shown, it just remains a predisposition. There often needs to be also an environmental trigger for the gene to be expressed and for the predisposition to manifest in the offspring. So it is not just the gene that is causing the behavior, but a relationship between the gene and interaction rather with the gene and the environment that causes the behavior to manifest. So the diathesis stress model is a very good example of how genes and the environment interact to develop a disorder. This is commonly used to understand depression. So the model is used to explain the origin of depression. This model argues that depression may be a result of the interaction between genetic predisposition and environmental stressors. The model also predicts that an individual with certain genes, when exposed to a stressful environment, is more likely to develop depression than someone who does not have that gene. While this is a great model, it can be further looked at in terms of a person who has a gene and is exposed to a stressful environment or an environmental stressor can be possibly not someone who is developing a disorder or depression. So let's say, for example, I have a predisposition or a gene for depression because my parents or my mom had it in the past, yeah, and I'm going through a lot of stress because of work. It is not necessary that even though these two factors are present for me, which would ideally mean that I develop depression, it is not necessary for me to develop depression because there are other factors that can fall into the whole correlation here, which is, let's say, for example, resilience, which basically means I'm strong, I am not knocked down by basic problems in life. So there are other factors or third variables that can influence the manifestation of a certain behavior, which is beyond just a genetic predisposition and environmental stressor. So this could be a little bit of a drawback of this model. So with that, this is basically the understanding that you need to have of how genetics work and function in relation to the environment, the different aspects of genetics and the terminology that you might want to just familiarize yourself with so that you can better understand research in this area. Like I said, this is the essential understanding that you need to have. It's pretty basic. As opposed to how much I've discussed so far. That was for you to understand things better. Now we're going to move on to techniques, research methods and techniques. Remember, like when we are studying the brain and behavior, research methods are lab experiments, quasi experiments, observations, etc. And techniques were the brain imaging techniques like EEG and autopsy, MRI, fMRI, and PET. So, the same way, the research methods used in the study of genetics are largely correlational, right? Since the independent variable is not manipulated, it's within the individual. The genes are within, it cannot be necessarily manipulated, although that is something that is happening in more recent studies. It's called the knockout method, where you basically knock out a certain gene and it causes a certain behavior to manifest. But that is extra information, and if you're interested into looking into that, that would be great for you. So that's research method, and there can be other research methods, such as maybe a quasi experiment, an observational study, and so on. But the techniques, which are different from research methods, used in this in the study of genetics and behavior, are twin studies, family studies, adoption studies, the genome, human genome project, and genome-wide association studies. So, to begin with, the Human Genome Project was found in the late 20th century. This is very different from the traditional ways of studying genetics, which was through twin, family, and adoption studies. This project allowed researchers to identify specific genes related to traits and behaviors through genetic mapping. So now, like we've talked about the 5-HTT allele, and how that leads or increases the vulnerability of an individual to manifest depression or develop depression. And then there's the MAOA gene as well, which has been identified to have an individual's aggression increased, right? So this project, the Human Genome Project, allowed us to make great leaps in the study of genetics. So what you're going to do next is go through in your group and do some research. I will assign you the different topics, and you will do research on either twin studies, family studies, adoption studies, genome project, and genome-wide association studies. I hope this lecture was helpful and you have somewhat a good understanding of genetics and the basics of it.